Hello, and welcome to today's Women in Climate Tech webinar on gender equity, climate risk, and getting to net zero faster. I am joined by some esteemed colleagues of mine who will introduce themselves in a little bit, but I just first wanted to welcome you and give you a little bit of background on Women in Climate Tech and why we're here today. So Women in Climate Tech has about 1,200 subscribers so far. It was co-founded by Helen Bertelli, Julianne Hogan, and Lisa Velez-Vararu. We have several organizations that are listed here. These are just examples of folks that come from a variety of different organizations around the world. We have a presence worldwide, and it's growing almost daily. It's an exciting group of women across the world who are really invested in and passionate about climate change and technology and the solutions that we can generate together. Women in Climate Tech empowers change makers. So we network, we collaborate with events like this. We generate speaking engagements for women. We really work together to elevate women's voices and build power for women in climate tech. This is certainly a dual strategy. So we empower change makers to enact change. Women are traditionally excellent change makers and go-getters. So bringing us all together and empowering each other really makes for a better change in this world and to address climate change head on. We have a three-tiered approach, starting with knowledge. So we have really solid foundation building with knowledge and research. We have a strong network that supports each other and mentors each other. And then we have a scaling approach where we build pitch boards and do some really in the weeds work with various different organizations. So a lot of what drove what we're going to discuss today was the climate related financial disclosures that really started with the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures in 2015 when the task force came together. And investors around the world and regulators and different governments, countries and around the world are really pushing for more transparency in climate-related financial disclosures. Here on the left, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard own a significant portion of publicly traded companies. Regulators, again, in the United States, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, who just came out with a proposed ruling on climate-related financial disclosures. So this move to more transparency of publicly traded companies on what they're doing to act on climate, so how they're reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, how they're planning for and addressing climate-related risks from physical impacts due to climate change, such as hurricanes and flooding, heat waves, higher sea level rise. So this is a time when everyone is on board with being more transparent about what companies are doing around the world to address climate change. And as I mentioned before, the Securities and Exchange Commission originally came out in 2010 with some guidance on climate-related disclosures, but it's been about a decade since that was released, and the SEC has now proposed a ruling to require publicly traded companies to disclose on climate-related risks and the financial implications of that, all the way from the governance of their board, the education of their board, the expertise of their board, all the way to supply chain and value chain to understand really what is going into the company in terms of operations for greenhouse gas emissions and what risks they might face to reducing those emissions, to not reducing those emissions, as well as the physical implications of climate change. So it's an exciting time. And the reason I give this background is because this really drove why we created the Task Force for Equity in Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This graphic is a little bit blurry, but here are all of the participants in the TECFD that we created last summer. And this was a group of women who were working in the TCFD space and noticed that justice and equity was not anywhere noted in the TCFD guidance and the implementation of it. And I work pretty significantly. I'm Emily Wasley. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. but I work with a lot of publicly traded Fortune 50s to Fortune 500 companies at a company called WSP. And I was noticing that there was a variety of different decisions that companies were starting to make to divest from already vulnerable communities. And we want to avoid that at all costs. We want to lean in to the communities that are on the front lines of climate change. And honestly, they're probably the most ready communities for climate change action and taking innovative approaches to addressing climate change. And we need to empower that around the world. So we will be coming out with a report with Aon, and this will have a lot of the research that the TCFD group developed last summer and this fall. And it's really built on 4 strategic pillars. So navigating volatility, building resilient workforces, rethinking access to capital, and addressing the underserved. So that said, I want to get into the exciting panel of various different questions that we have ready for the panelists. And with that, I'm going to start with our first panelist. And I'm going to ask Meredith to introduce herself briefly and discuss kind of what is the business case for gender equity and climate change tech.
Thanks, Emily, and I am delighted to be here today. My name is Meredith Jones. My background is as an investor. I've spent 23 years in the investment industry, and the last 10 focused on responsible investing and ESG and issues around decarbonization and climate change. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I've done research around why we would all be richer if there were more women that were involved in the capital markets and investing, just generally speaking. And like that area, climate change and climate change technology is no different. There's really a very compelling business case to be made for having women be more integrated into climate change technology development, intellectual property, all of those things. And I really break it down into 2 things. So a long time ago, longer than I care to think about, as the gray streak in my hair would tend to indicate, somebody told me that really people are interested only in 2 things: dealing with pain and generating gain. And when you look at women as it relates to climate change, there's really arguments to be had for women helping to mitigate pain and generate gain across the board. When I think about it, I really look at a couple of different things. Number one, there's just the instance that we know that more diverse companies are more profitable. And so for companies that are involved in climate change tech or anything else, if you are not a diverse company, whether that's board diversity, C-suite diversity, or employee diversity, you likely are not as profitable as you could be. And that's something that ultimately harms a lot of stakeholders, from your shareholders all the way to your employees. Another thing to think about it is those shareholders. Increasingly, what we're seeing is a number of shareholders out there, including some of the ones that Emily just highlighted, saying, look, we're not going to invest in companies that don't have robust diversity, equity, and inclusion policies in place, because we know that hurts our money. And as a result, we don't want to do it. Not to mention the fact, of course, it's not just or equitable, but when it comes right down to it, that's a hit to our pocketbook. It creates more volatility. It generates pain for us. And therefore, we expect you as a company to have diverse boards, diverse C-suites, to disclose information about your diversity and what you're doing to build it in order for us to maintain an investment. And if you don't, then we either won't invest with you, or we're going to engage with you in an active ownership campaign to try to make you do this. So that's a pretty big reason to do that as well. In addition, we know that gender diversity leads to better innovation. And we see this when we look at things like patents, for example. Patents are overwhelmingly held by well-to-do white men at this point in time. But if we were to start seeing more diverse patents, we know a few things about them. Number one, they tend to be cited more often, meaning that they're more useful. And number two, they tend to be also more defensible. So that means that they're more robust patents to begin with. So that's a pain issue. You want to make sure that your intellectual property is as robust and useful as possible. And then also there's some gain there as well. We know that if there were more diverse patentship, there were more women involved in developing technology, that we would actually see a jump in GDP. Could be anywhere from a few basis points all the way up to 4%. But still, that's a pretty big gain. So when you put pain and gain together, I see this not just as important, but as something that's imperative.
Thank you, Meredith. Would anyone else like to add to that? Okay, our next question. Given the SEC's recent move to mandate climate risk disclosure, how does gender factor in? What are the considerations for companies, the supply chain, and beyond in communities? Jameson, if you could just introduce yourself and give your thoughts on this question.
Sure, and I think the answer to this question builds upon a lot of what Meredith said, so hopefully it'll add more texture to that. So I'm Jameson Rogers Gibson, and I'm a climate strategy and policy expert who's been working in the field for nearly 20 years now, focusing on advancing equitable climate action through the public sector and increasingly so through the private sector, including work on the economic risks of climate change here in the US. And I had the honor of being the team lead for the strategy component of the TCFD research this past summer. And a lot of that research focused on the workforce, particularly as it relates to supply chain and women-owned businesses. So I think I just want to echo Emily's point that the proposed rule right now does not explicitly focus on social equity. So I want to call that out. And as Meredith shared, a gender agnostic approach has the risk of overlooking critical climate risks and also foregoing significant opportunities in the value chain to reduce greenhouse gases and increase resilience. And that can impact a company's bottom line and also run the risks of perpetuating or exacerbating existing inequities in the communities that these companies operate in. So specifically speaking to supply chains, companies should look at the people dimension in addition to infrastructure and inputs. And so quickly, a few things to think about, starting with what role do women play? How many women-owned businesses do you have? What's the proportion of your labor force who are women? Because that'll really inform the climate risks and the opportunities, which is the other key part of the rule that you'll decide to look at. So for instance, thinking about two sectors that have large female workforces in their supply chain, it's apparel and ag, and they also tend to be some of the largest greenhouse gas emitters and very vulnerable to climate risk. So thinking about the gender equity piece is key there. Also think about the gendered barriers that these women face. It could be access to resources or cultural or educational or legal, and how those barriers hinder their ability to adapt and recover from climate impacts, which once again increases climate risks, decreases productivity and resilience in your supply chain. And are there ways that your company can address them? Going back to the ag sector once again, a lack of access to capital is a huge barrier for women, and research has shown that if they have similar access to capital as men, that they can increase their ag yields by 20 to 30%, which is pretty significant. Another thing to think about, which gets to Meredith's point about innovation, is considering the unique value add that women bring, the skills and the knowledge, and how empowering them and involving them in decisions related to your supply chain can really help you innovate and problem solve and have a more agile, resilient, and zero carbon supply chain. And then lastly, as greenhouse gas emissions is a key part of the disclosure, thinking about the impacts of a net zero strategy on women in your supply chain. Are you unintentionally but disproportionately excluding them from the workforce? Or are you helping them upskill to be part of the net zero economy? And so harkening back to apparel, which has a very significant number of women in the workforce, some efforts to reduce greenhouse gases could include increasing efficiencies and reducing emissions through automation, which then risks potential significant job losses, which have a lot of ripple impacts. And so unless there's a specific focus on prioritizing training and upskilling for new jobs, there will be these negative impacts. And then there is also the business benefit of that too, of a more trained workforce, and then also minimizing reputational risks from consumers, particularly female consumers, who increasingly are really valuing companies that support women. So that helps as well. I will pass to Nahali because I know she has a lot of rich experience to share and how this applies to communities.
Thanks, Jameson. So my name is Nahali Anupriya. I've been working at the cross-section of climate, sustainable development, and disaster risk reduction for the United Nations, supporting a lot of small island state governments, as well as least developed countries governments, and a lot of the international policy processes. So I've had the distinct opportunity to kind of look at this from a very kind of macro perspective and seeing the kind of bird's eye view of how all of these intersecting parts kind of come together. With respect to that, I think this element of communities really needs to move beyond thinking about communities and community welfare as something that's separate to our economic output and our kind of monetary gains and industrial and innovation gains. I loved how Meredith was explaining this idea of dealing with pain and making gains as kind of the two main levers you have to push. The way I think about this is, we do things that raise the ceiling of what possible human existence can look like, and we do things that can raise the floor of what the worst case scenario can kind of look like for various communities and individuals. The amazing thing about taking a gender responsive approach to climate change and climate solutions is that you get to do both at the same time. I think that's where we bring in this element of community resilience. If I can make one key message here, it would be that community resilience isn't just the sum of every individual person's resilience in any given community, city, or country. The way people, families, different kind of parts of the community work together to recover from economic, climate, and social related crises is far more complex than just whether one person in a family or every key component in a family were able to bounce back from a crisis in the same way. Some of the examples that we can look to quite recently with the pandemic, the way that family structures had to be reorganized to account for people working from home, how care responsibilities shift with members falling ill, or with people needing to isolate and not being able to rely on the same kind of social safety nets that we normally are able to do so, right? This obviously impacts people's ability to show up to work, to do the work that they need to do, and to create the value that we know that they can create. This is compounded more than 2 times over when we bring in the gender lens to this. A woman's ability to contribute to her professional and her private kind of environment are more than the sum of the total parts of kind of the health of those two lifestyles in and of themselves. So when we look at considerations for companies, I love the questions that Jameson was asking. And I think here we talk about the hidden cost of not asking those questions, right? When we're forgetting to acknowledge that 51% of consumers in most markets are going to be female, when we forget about the fact that the inordinate amount of economic and social multipliers that exist when we prioritize both female production and consumption in these spaces. And then when we zoom out another level and talk about this idea of justice between communities and lower served communities, when we prioritize greenhouse gas emission reductions and climate responsiveness, what are we doing to communities where we have high rates of pollution and emission that have high dependencies on those particular sectors, on those specific kind of workforce components? And what does a net zero transition strategy look like? Are we creating more harm in the process? So I think that's the big kind of missing piece here, that we are better, or I choose to believe that we are better than transitioning to net zero whilst making the same mistakes of 50 years ago, when we weren't thinking about the social costs of those decisions. We have an opportunity here to prioritize a path that, yes, requires a few more webinars and a few more kind of cross-populating ideas, but we can get there in a much more efficient manner that really brings everyone along in the process. But that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Nahali and Jameson. And I completely agree. COVID was an excellent example of, the gender disparities. I know several friends of mine, female friends of mine in the climate space, that because they made less than their husbands, needed to stay home and care for their children. So let's change that disparity. And Jameson, I have a question for you. So how might social inequity translate into increased business risk and volatility?
Sure, and I can speak to the supply chain piece of that, but Emily, for those who don't know, Emily is actually definitely an expert in this area, and she helped lead some of the work around governance for the TECFD. So would love to hear from you, Emily, as well on your thoughts about that. I can kick it off, and then if you want to share some points. So as we've been talking about social inequities, and that is gender, but there also are social inequities by race or ethnicity and class. I mean, there's a very, very long list, and they really affect access to opportunity and can amplify the harmful impacts of climate change. And as Emily said, we saw this with COVID, with women leaving the workforce at an alarming rate. And we've seen this time and time again in response to climate impacts, not just overseas, but here in the United States as well. And so thinking about the supply chain, what I previously shared applied, it impacts women-owned businesses, impacts minority-owned businesses, small businesses. And also when you think about the supply chains, the other aspect is the labor-intensive supply chains that really rely on a stable and productive labor supply. So if you have a catastrophic event and there are structural or systemic barriers that are really hindering the ability of people to adapt and recover, that, and whether that's socioeconomic or political or cultural, that is going to affect employee stability. And that is going to have implications for business risks and for supply chain stability. And that gets back to Nahali's point about the ability for people to show up at work, but then also to be able to help their communities and have resilience in their communities as well. And on the flip side of that, we saw that addressing these barriers also presents a huge business opportunity. So identifying them and then taking measures to address it can help build resilience into your supply chain to navigate this climate-related volatility. And just to point back to the comment that I made about the ag sector, providing women who are key parts of that productive capacity with similar resources as men can increase their ag yields by 20 to 30%, which can then also, bringing their skills and knowledge of ag and land stewardship, can really help them be able to bring adaptive practices that can also help navigate that volatility. And I'll toss it over to Emily to add some more points as well.
Jameson, and the supply chain, we've seen some significant impacts to supply chain through COVID that will only continue as the climate changes. And there, as Jameson mentioned, there are both risks and opportunities when we act on climate. So from the business perspective, we've done a lot of research, as I mentioned, through the TECFD program. And the report that will come out this week in partnership with Aon really illustrates that inequity is a business risk. Only 2% of global assets are managed by women. If you think about that, that is a significantly low number. that needs to be increased. And it's an area that is increasingly getting more diverse, but only if companies that own these assets do put females or have equity on their board. And it's really interesting to see from a business perspective the decisions that are made at the board level when there are females on the board, when there are different racial representation on the board. And it's really also imperative that we understand and really see light into how these board members and managers within the companies are educated on climate change. A lot of what climate change has been addressed, the departments that have been addressing climate change to date has been the sustainability team. And it's really traditionally been mostly females, and which is excellent, but at the same time, they're kind of an outlier to the financial team, to the legal team, to the auditing team that really is able to make the decisions and determine what the trajectory of the company is. So gender equity as a business opportunity, McKinsey came out with some research that said, women make decisions 2 times faster, and gender equitable teams make quicker decisions with half the meetings, which is pretty telling to the amount of time that we could be saving on really climate action. There's a lot of research also on the fact that women spend 4 times more traveling than men globally. So we spend a lot more money when it comes to the economy and investing in our communities. So it's really a business risk, but also a business opportunity to really develop gender equity across the company. So Meredith, coming back to you, how can the capital markets play a role in driving gender equity and thus helping to reduce volatility and increase resilience?
Well, that's a great question, and one that I have been struggling with for quite some time during my career. I always tell people that when I first started out in the investment industry, it took me 10 years to meet another woman who had a job similar to mine. Which I think is very telling just for the lack of diversity that we still face in this space. And in fact, when you look across the capital markets, I think roughly 20% of all chief investment officers, which means the folks that are managing pension endowment, foundation, the big money, the institutional money out there, are women. Only about 12% of senior private equity professionals are women. Only about 8 to 9% of both venture capital professionals and mutual fund professionals are women. Only about 3% of hedge fund professionals are women. So the numbers are not great. And unfortunately, what that results in is that there are just not, there's not a lot of opportunities for female-run companies, for example, to get funding. We've tended to see those numbers hover right around 2%, 2.2%, I think is the highest I've seen it go. And that was deserving of nothing more than a very unenthusiastic golf clap for actually clearing that 2% barrier. And that's a problem, right? Because again, if you're not having the innovation that you need to have, then we're really not going to meet the challenges of climate change head on in any kind of appreciable way. One of the questions that came up in the panel was asking about, or came up in the chat, was asking about why would we see such a massive increase in GDP if we had more female inventors? And the answer to that, I think, is fairly straightforward. Right now, if you look at innovative industries, they account for about 1/3 of GDP. If you look at women in those industries, they account for about 1/3, 28, 29% of the employees at those firms. But they only account for about 12% of the patents. So again, if you accept that diverse patents tend to be more cited and more defensible and therefore higher quality patents, if you also accept the fact that diverse teams tend to come to better and more innovative solutions, that means that individual companies and the capital markets, VC, PE, everyone is leaving money on the table. And that is not a desirable outcome, I think, for anybody. So really, I think the first step is to get more diversity into the investing industry, period, meaning the folks that are actually writing the checks, so that naturally the companies and the founders and the technologies that we're looking at ultimately become more representative of the vast amounts of talent and creativity that can be driven by having lots of different perspectives come on board in order to create that value. But if we don't have that first step, then that's going to continue to be a problem. The good news is that there are organizations that are tackling that at this point. The Institutional Investor Diversity Cooperative, for example, started an initiative in early 2021 that is now asking all asset managers to disclose their levels of diversity across a number of different metrics, and also to show the policies and procedures that they're doing there. A lot of investors are more and more focused on this at this point, and they're not just looking at single diversity metrics. This was another question that came up in the chat panel. They're not just looking at the numbers, because the numbers don't tell you that much. You know, I always say that diversity is like being asked to the prom, but inclusion is like being asked to dance while you're there. So the diversity numbers are telling us one part of the story, but it's incomplete. So a lot of the investors out there are asking asset managers not just to disclose what their diversity totals are, but they're also looking at their inclusion policies, they're looking at engagement. And perhaps one of the factors that I think is the most telling on things like that, they're looking at things like voluntary turnover to see if diverse individuals are turning over at a higher rate than the rest of the organization, because that for sure is a measure that inclusion still needs to come a long way. So unfortunately, it's not a simple answer. There's a lot of levers that need to be pulled here in order for the capital markets to fully activate in this area. But I think those are some of the more women in the seats that are allocating capital, more companies that are diverse and have female founders getting capital, and then we'll hopefully start to see the natural and beneficial outcomes from that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Meredith. Lori, I'd love your thoughts on this question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Lori Collins. I'm a principal at Collins Climate Consulting and focus on helping accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy for both communities and businesses. And I specifically focus on investors and financial services providers. My background is in financial services with Fidelity Investments and Bank of America. I was an executive with LendingTree for many years and have been in various financial capacities in the clean energy space since then. So that tends to be the focus I bring. On the TECFD team this summer, I was the lead for the risk management team. And that's, a lot of the focus in the investor world is on risk management, but also there's a lot of opportunity. And that's, when we look at where the capital markets can play, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity on the capital market side. And I want to acknowledge Heather in the chat mentioned green banks. Before I get into some of the things I was going to mention, green banks are a great opportunity for the capital markets to work with green banks. A lot of times green banks will provide incentives for the capital markets that can take some of the risk out of lending and other types of investments. So green banks definitely have an important role, especially in many cases are public-private initiatives. So I'm just going to build on what Meredith talked about. She was kind of looking at some macro ways that the capital markets can make a difference, but there's also some very specific ways. Like one of the things that is mentioned in the Aon paper is the potential for microinsurance. And that is just a very specific exemplar of an innovative financial tool that can address climate, but also specifically work with women. And the insurance industry in general, I'm doing Meredith's part of the role for her on, since she's the insurance person here, but the insurance industry has a big role to play in climate solutions in general. I mean, for, just kind of beyond what we're talking about with the gender solutions, looking at how the insurance industry can provide incentives for more resilient infrastructure or for more resilient buildings and companies. I mean, that, so the insurance industry definitely has a big role to play in the capital markets. Another possible role for capital markets is with accelerator programs. And I'm sure most of you are familiar. Accelerator programs are initiatives that help incubate emerging technologies. And there's accelerator programs popping up all over the place that are getting more and more specific. So there's clean tech accelerators, climate tech accelerators. Some accelerators focus on very specific parts of the world. So you can envision having an accelerator program focused on this particular issue. Where can we look for solutions that have that interplay of reducing climate risk or providing opportunities around climate solutions, but also address gender equity? So I think that's an opportunity for a venture capital firm or a private equity firm that is looking for a new type of accelerator program. And sort of a different angle on some of the things that Meredith talked about around percentages. When we look at the venture capital funding, women only get about 1% of venture capital funding. So how can we address that? How do we encourage more investment in women-owned companies? And we can't tell investors where to place their money. We can't force it, but we can raise awareness around the opportunities in this type of investing. And we can provide success stories. We can showcase positive returns when there's gender metrics included. So when I say we, who is we? It's organizations like Gender Smart, the 30% Coalition that was referenced in the Aon report, and organizations like Women in Climate Tech that can help raise awareness of this issue. So I think that's it for me. I can toss it back to the next question, Emily.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, and that's an excellent point about knowledge sharing, just sharing success stories on how women have been change makers on the ground, but also in the boardrooms and in the financial space, and how that can increase over time. Dr. Viverette Batiste, I know that we had a little bit of technical issues to begin with, but I wanted to get your perspective on, one, the business case for gender equity and climate change tech, but also your lived experience through Katrina and how that affected you directly and how that affected your business when you were in that location.
Oh, thank you, Emily, for swinging back and being understanding about this technology. My name is LaTanya, just as Emily said, and she's so kind to say Dr. Batiste, but I've been at this a long time by blood and sweat and by education. So thanks, Em, for giving me that shout out. We are personable because we work together. I too work at WSP on those really, really hard, answering those hard questions for those huge clients. And then my passion project is Brown in the Green. You see, there are very few brown people in this green space, and the green economy is here. So every chance I get, I'm on the front lines trying to bring women and all people of color in that look like me. So to answer your question about displacement after a climate-related event as big and enormous as Katrina, back when I had that happen to me, we were fortunate enough to be relocated to Colorado Springs for a company. A company actually gave us a relocation package. How sweet was that? But there were hundreds of folks that were not in my position to get that. They didn't even have enough money to get gas to get out of town. This is becoming the case worldwide, and we must do something about it. So thanks, Emily, for asking me to speak on that, but also asking me to speak on the business case, why we should have this. And I'd like to echo what Meredith said about having, if the company does right by their people, it's just really the simple. If you do right by your people, they stay. And if you have people that have things in common with other people, it reduces employee turnover. If you don't turn over, that's less money you have to spend out. Everything goes to the bottom line. Collectively, the improvements that Meredith talked about, that Lori talked about, others have talked about, these improvements go to the bottom line, like I said, and an inclusive business culture leads to like a 59% increase if you have this in creativity, innovation, and guess what? Just being open and listening. It's not really complicated. You just got to be willing. So you don't have to believe me, just believe the numbers. They don't lie.
Thanks, LaTanya. I always love your perspective and love working with you as well. So Lori, let me turn it back to you. So how do capital markets need to transform to support gender resilience and climate change?
You know, there's a lot of initiatives that we've discussed and a lot of things that can be done. But when I think in terms of transformation, something that's more systemic, I think of three things: reporting, incentives, and accountability. And, you know, it's actually very similar to what the SEC proposal is looking for: reporting, incentives, and accountability. And, you know, when we look at what the SEC is calling for around, and I'll read some of this because I know we talk about the SEC proposal, but the specifics are prospective risk and material impacts on the business strategy and outlook caused by climate change, and gives a specific example of disclosing asset risk at a zip code level. If you can imagine going the next step and asking and calling for risk by gender in terms of populations, that's the kind of reporting and accountability that we need to get to at some level. I'm not necessarily suggesting that it has to be regulated and written into law, but those are the types of ways that we're going to really have transformational change. We can look to the Race to Resilience program. The way Race to Resilience is setting their metrics is by calling for metrics around the number of people impacted in specific communities. They're looking for specific numbers of people, focusing on, you know, not just, you know, broad metrics, but bringing it back to the human level. So potentially a group like Race to Resilience could say, let's also call for a breakdown. What percentage of the people impacted are women? Percentage of impact in terms of both risk and solutions. And that would be very illuminating. I think if more people realize that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women, that's almost shocking. Why is it 80%? And then that just, I think, would help motivate action, but it really starts with that, with the quantitative reporting and accountability. So I think that's the number one. And just another transformation could potentially come from the ESG reporting agencies. So if you look at SASB and GRI as two of the major ESG reporting agencies, SASB in particular calls for disclosing what's material to your specific industry. And they even look for things like, ethics and journalism. I mean, it can get fairly granular. So if an organization like SASB started looking at the interplay, and I think there's a term in your PowerPoint about, this is a shortcut to reducing risk. If you look at where there's an interplay between gender and climate, so a group like that could help move things along by asking for disclosures around where are you getting that extra juice by looking at these two initiatives together. And I think that would be helpful because sometimes ESG can just feel like a laundry list or the kitchen sink of disclosures. But if we start looking at where there's synergy between these various ESG factors, that could be very powerful and helpful to organizations.
Thanks, Laura. You're absolutely right. I mean, there's a whole plethora of different standards and frameworks out there. It's really hard for companies to navigate, but I think slowly but surely they're starting to culminate together and work together, and hopefully the distinction between ESG and climate risk will be clearer and be integrated. Nahali, would love your thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So a couple of ideas. One, I think part of what we're asking for here is transformational leadership, right? And leadership that's very well versed and kind of aware of these related issues and how they magnify each other and how they work together. But related to the G in ESG, I think there's a little bit of over-reliance on looking at female representation on boards, for example, and in leadership positions. I think this is something that we as a community want to see throughout the entire kind of career ladder in every company. We see a lot of very equity focused and representation focused kind of intake level positions where, a company's internship class or their first year associates or whatnot are relatively balanced. And then at the top level, at boards and kind of the political appointment level, we see that sort of representation as well. But somewhere in the middle, we don't see the same amount of diversity or inclusion. So we miss this opportunity for company cultures to be rooted in gender responsiveness and climate responsiveness all the way through their operations. So one thing I'd say with thinking about the transformation that we want is, how do you build that diversity and inclusion all the way through an organizational structure so that you can have the benefits of inclusion and diversity of views and representation at every single level of the decision-making process? That means that you've got fail-safes at every single level of decision-making to make sure that these questions aren't falling through the cracks. So that's kind of step one. The other thing that I wanted to highlight a little bit is the role of public-private partnerships and cross-private partnerships as well. A lot of the investments that we see, especially in SMEs, in lower income areas, for female founders, are driven by a very small subsection of the financing community, right? We've got VCs, we've got like the Planet Plus community who choose to prioritize investments in female-led startups and organizations, which is fantastic, but we can't let it fall to this small minority of very focused organizations to kind of cover for the rest of the industry, right? This needs to be something that that is mainstreamed and is accepted and across the board. One of the ways that I think these partnerships can work a little bit, and I think Laurie was mentioning it earlier, this idea of de-risking, what are perceived to be risky investments. When we talk about a just transition towards a net zero or a low carbon economy, how do we need to structure that process so that the financial risk is taken upfront by green banks, or the Green Climate Fund comes to mind, the GEF, other like international kind of financing mechanisms as well, so that private capital can do what private capital is best placed to do, which is to create the scale and the speed and agility that we need to make this transition by 2030. So I think those partnerships are ripe to be kind of plucked out of thin air now. There's been a lot of progress over the last, I'd say, like 10 years, and it's been really, really welcome to see both the push on the public financing side and on the private financing side to mean that we've got a relatively ripe environment for those two sides of the coin to come together and work together to prioritize social equity and gender equity, whilst also retaining financing in historically risky communities or parts of the country or parts of the world. But those are my two cents.
Thanks, Nahalini. I think Meredith has some thoughts on this as well. Go ahead, Meredith.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention too, and to Laurie's point, for me, of me not standing up for insurers quite as much as I should, I think that it's been an interesting discussion to have, because I've been talking to some organizations that are looking at doing some of these public-private partnerships to provide specifically capital into the hands of smallhold farmers and things like that. And the problem is given the proportion of people that are uninsured or underinsured at this point, their ability to pay back a bond, even if it is a small loan, a micro loan that they're given, in the event of a climate change disaster, which of course are becoming more frequent and more vigorous, for a lack of a better word, is really not great. And so attracting capital into a vehicle like that doesn't have some sort of insurance component to it, basically, I think can be a real turnoff for investors, because they know the likelihood that that's going to be repaid is pretty low. And so I think we need to be very cognizant of these different risks and figure out how can we package all the different types of capital together, insurance with actual money. How can we look at natural capital, financial capital, human capital, all of those things holistically so that we get to a good answer. You know, we've been talking a lot about creativity and innovation on this. Part of this is that we're going to have to innovate the answer here. It's not simple. There's not one lever that we're going to need to pull. All of these things have to work in concert together in order to get us to the answer. So what can we come up with to attract capital into those types of investments? How can we make it safer? How can we you know, tie in, for example, is there a carbon offset component there? There's lots of different ways to try to get this fixed, and we're just going to have to try a lot of them and see what ultimately you know, adds the most value. But my guess is that there's not one thing that's going to be the silver bullet here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us are really talking about this transformational change that is here, right? We need it. It's happening, but it's happening a little too slowly. I have the honor of being the chapter lead for the adaptation component of the National Climate Assessment, the 5th National Climate Assessment. And, you know, we can't continue to do the things that we did in the past. And one example is the fact that we've been investing in disaster response recovery so heavily. We need to prepare for the events that are happening and invest in the communities that are hit first and worst. And a lot of times it's the communities that are have been traditionally marginalized. And if we empower the communities before the event happens, they'll be more resilient, more prepared, and truly can thrive in the face of change, and show us how it's done innovatively.
And
That's a great point, Emily.
Oh, go ahead, LaTanya.
Thank you, Jameson. Emily, it's a great point when you say empower the community. The communities that are impacted the most are the ones that really are going to give us the solutions that we need. They're there, they're fighting it every day. In fact, they've been fighting it before we ever came up with this term, climate change or resilience. They have the answers, just like they had the answers on drugs. Those mothers, they know what to tell you what to do. They've been gardening for years. You don't have to bring them a community garden. They probably all already have something in their backyard. I know my 90-year-old grandmother still gardens in Mississippi. So that was an excellent point. Or go to the community, listen to the community, and then try to integrate the technology with the institutional knowledge, and then you'll get somewhere. And that stands for also trying to get a certain demographic in this field. I saw a lot on the chat about how do we do it? Where do we announce? First of all, you got to build a whole lot of trust. There has to be a whole lot of trust. People are still feeling really awful, really bad ramifications because of redlining. It's real. There's a humongous intersection between redlining, and they still live in the communities where they were impacted 40, 50 years ago, no generational wealth. And then you say, hey, let me come save you. You got to build it, and it's going to take time.
Awesome points, LaTanya. And I wanted to just add a little bit more from my experience working here at the local level. Where I live, we've been doing some work with communities to inform development of our climate action plan, really trying to center equity. And equity means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And one of the things that I've learned is the value of listening and going in. We have assumptions. Those assumptions most of the time are probably wrong or ill-informed or outdated. And so really going in and listening and coming alongside and co-creating solutions. And so that applies to working in communities. It applies to businesses wanting to bring in a female perspective on different approaches and solutions. And I think that that idea of co-creating is incredibly important as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jameson. So I think a lot of us have been answering some of the questions in the chat or via our comments. So I'm going to take the opportunity to ask Lori and LaTanya a question about where are we starting to see improvements that would lead to a more just transition for women?
You want to go first, Lori?
Sure. Well, I think the SEC disclosure proposal is a huge step forward. Now, that doesn't specifically address women, but it starts requiring that accountability that we're all looking for that can be built on. So I think we should, it's a proposal, it's not in law yet, but that's a huge step forward. And obviously the growth of ESG is huge for the industry, and there's a lot of work still being done on ESG. There's a lot of confusion around it, what needs to be disclosed, what's material. So it's still evolving, and there's a lot of interest in sort of standardizing and rationalizing ESG, but it's here to stay. There's so much energy behind it, and sometimes I feel like there's a confusion between climate risk versus ESG, but a lot of work is being done to pull that together. So those are big improvements, and obviously DEI is crucial as well. And we've talked about that today, but DEI is integrated in everything. I mean, companies, sports teams, arts organizations, it is well integrated. And we couldn't have said that 2 years ago. I don't think the term DEI was even mainstream 2 years ago. So that's a huge step forward in bringing attention to the women's side of what we're talking about. And then, of course, specific initiatives, like things that are referred to in the Aon report, things like ensure resilience and gender smart investing. All those things add up as well. So I'll toss it to you, LaTanya.
Thanks, Lori. And I agree with you. We have seen major improvements in some areas, and then we've seen slight improvements in other areas. But just recently in a 2021 report from Lean In and McKinsey, they do that every year, this huge report. You cannot deny that women of color were promoted to managers. We were just so excited. But at the same time, it's like 85 women of color were promoted for every 100. Yay. We started doing cheerleading, dancing, and we realized that it's important. But if we truly want to make a difference, we need to follow, the companies need to follow the recommendations that we all have said here. And if we really want to improve the workplace in general, we need to change the culture so it speaks to the diversity and inclusion, and then they'll become more competitive. But despite these improvements, and I don't want to be LaTanya gloomy, but women are still underrepresented, particularly those women of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ plus women are much more likely than men to encounter microaggressions. That's why you got to get into the culture. So these challenges impact all types of things, and this demographic continues to lose ground at every job level, and that's even in 2021. So there's so much work to be done while there have been great improvement.
Hey team, this is Helen. I'm just going to weigh in for just a second. Just to say, I've got a link to the published report I'm going to put in the chat. And also reference to my email, which if you have any job postings for the Women in Climate Tech Network, please reach out to me. Also to mention, we've got a phenomenal mentorship program. They're actually kicking off their first meeting in just a minute. We've got over 100 mentees, which the mentorship committee has been pairing. We're looking for people to sponsor and underwrite that, as well as potentially the launch of Girls in Climate Tech. So many exciting programs that you could help and support. So please reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the notes here. And thank you again. Thanks to all the panelists, and I'll let Emily finish it off.
Thank you so much, Helen. That's so exciting. So I'm going to take this opportunity to do a quick lightning round for all the panelists. We know that obviously solutions don't develop overnight. This is going to take time. It's going to take hard work, blood, sweat, tears, all the things that we have that we can give. What is one action that a company could take today that would start to make headway on the issue of gender equity and climate change? Now, Holly, I'm going to start with you since you're at the top of my page here.
Sure. Less in action for a company and more in action for the individuals listening to us today. The next time you're in a meeting where you've got both women and men at the table, make a little diagram of who's sat around your table. And every time someone speaks, draw an arrow from who is speaking to who they are speaking. Who they're speaking to. What you'll get at the end of this is a snapshot of who, one, speaks the most in that room, and two, who all of those people think makes a lot of decisions and is the person that they need to direct their questions to. So it gives you a really nice starting point of kind of, dealing with your own team's company culture and your company culture more broadly, of how decisions are made within your organization. So top tip.
Love that, Nahali. Thank you. Lori, go ahead.
Okay, my mantra is what gets measured gets done. If you want to lose weight, you have to step on the scale. So I think, set a goal, set some milestones, and that every company can do that.
Thanks, Lori. Meredith.
And this is something I was saying in the chat. You've got to start earlier than you think you do. A lot of the interventions start happening at college and graduate school level, and we've already had the pipeline narrow before that happens. And so I know it's a long lead time investment to get involved and earlier than that, and that can be really daunting, and it can mean that you have to look at it from a CSR or a charitable giving part of your organization as opposed to a talent acquisition part. It's still worth it. It's so worth it, because otherwise it's going to take years for us to actually make improvements.
Agreed. LaTanya.
I want to echo Meredith when she said start early. And then also earlier I heard the trend of culture. So when you marry those two, if you start really early and change the culture, it's inevitable things will change.
Jameson.
So many great points raised. So I will echo everything that everyone else has said. And in terms of something that folks can do today, commit to looking at your own workforce from leadership all the way through your supply chain or the companies you invest in, and see how women are represented along the value chain. Compare that to goals that we've talked about today. And if you're in the fortunate place where you've already done that, then start thinking about how to integrate that or combine that with analyses you're doing on your climate risks and opportunities to inform your strategy and risk management practices. Think about what you need to do that, what you need to get there. And then I know, as is mentioned in the Aon report, this may also mean working more closely between the DEI teams and the climate teams as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. I've loved having you on this panel and couldn't thank you enough for your time, for your dedication to climate action, and hope to see you all soon. And thanks for everyone for joining us today. Take good care.